Welcome to Interviews from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlson, and I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues with the men and women who know them best, here on Telesur. The first month of the government of Andres Manuel López Obrador has been very eventful and controversial. But that's not unusual. Most administrations come in with bold moves against corruption or reorganizing institutions to set the tone and put their marks on the new administration. So what will be the tone of this administration? Today on Interviews from Mexico, we want to talk about the actual deeds and declarations in these early weeks of the administration of Andres Manuel López Obrador. And we're very pleased to have with us here in the studio a Gibrán Ramírez. Gibrán, thanks for being with us here on Interviews from Mexico.
It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Gibrán is an up-and-coming young intellectual, a national commentator, and recently the Secretary General of the Interamerican Conference on Social Security. Gibrán, you've been close to the transition to the new government and to the new president himself. What's your reading of these first weeks of the López Obrador administration?
I think, without a doubt, that there's have been weeks of intense work. It's been a radical difference from previous presidents. It seems like it's been like more than the first 100 days of the administration of Enrique Peña Nieto or Felipe Calderón. A lot of things have been done. They've touched a lot of issues because there has an authentic
And a lot
organization.
of this happened during the transition period, even before he took office, which is kind of unusual too, isn't it?
Yes, Lopez Obrador began to govern before formally taking power. The best example is the consultation on the New Mexico City airport that, well, had an impact even in the markets, and notably political impact too, because it marked the tone of the new policy, and it did it even before taking office.
And it's kind of that consultation on the new airport was in many ways a direct confrontation, not just with the old government, which it was one of its pet projects, but also with the markets that responded in a powerful way. It was kind of a showdown of forces in that sense. And we've seen a couple of those in these early weeks. Were they intentional or was the response a little bit beyond what they expected?
I think the markets responded, they overreacted. This kind of a drop in the stock market sometimes it's not really caused by technical terms or by changing the risk factor that are objectively probable. There is a lot of subjectivity. For example, the political risk analysts from the different firms in market present their analysis of the situation, and according to those analyses, that's how big investors respond. Many of those analyses were terrible. They were catastrophic. I remember one, I can't remember from what investment company it was in particular, but it said there that Andres Manuel López Obrador could use the consultations to keep himself in power indefinitely. It's what occurred to them to imagine at that moment.
Complete speculation.
Absolutely. It had nothing to do with political science, with theory, nothing to do with a serious perspective. It was the oligarchy's fears projected in terms of analysis, which is not the same as doing the real analysis.
So what's the possibility we're talking not just about overreaction, but about manipulation?
Yes, in a way, yes. I think in large part also because on the part of sectors of the right, they haven't understood what the change in government is about. But more and more, I should say, especially with the presentation of the budget, the annual budget, reactions have changed. They've seen that this is not a government of the extreme left. There isn't, for example, a plan for profound fiscal reformations. That's not there. So the markets have been calm, and all the catastrophic predictions that the peso was going to plummet have been proven wrong in barely a month of the administration, really quickly. And the peso is still appreciating to the dollar. Well, that's also due to international factors. And the expectation of the vast majority of the population is optimistic.
High approval rating so far.
Yeah, definitely. Higher than Vicente Fox, and it's interesting that Fox's approval rating was different. Since then, the media was sympathetic for the general feeling of hope. It was seen as a consensus. Now, there is an even higher approval rating and more hope with Lopez Obrador, but the traditional media are against the new government, so it's seen as polarization. Even though around 80% or somewhere around that are hopeful about the administration of Lopez Obrador. Well, in the Mexican political discourse, that's portrayed as polarization.
Yeah.
But I think that's not really the case in actual experience in Mexico today.
So we have this contradiction between what is actually a higher level of consensus than we've had in the past, but that's presenting itself, especially because of the media, as a polarization. And you can see that polarization in the society and in social networks as well. It's not just the media. So it's a particularly vocal and active opposition that's formed not just since he took office, but from before. Well, you mentioned the airport as one of the first measures. The consultation that took place before he took office. What do you think have been the other measures in these early weeks that have marked where this government is going?
I will point out several. One that I think don't have the made impact it deserved is the largest increase in the minimum wage in nearly 30 years. This demonstrates the social commitment of the presidency of the Republic. And second, social policy, which is the most ambitious that has been put forth in Mexican history. A third area, I'd say in general, and this is associated with the issue of the airport, is the predominance of political power over economic power.
Explain that.
This has been a real defining feature of the administration. In the case of the airport, the economic interest and the political interest of the administration of Enrique Peña Nieto were actually intertwined like a cartel, and the PAN was also closely involved. This economic power predominated over political decisions. Beyond the technical debate over the airport, it was really obvious that this was a major gambit of the most powerful economic interests in Mexico. In another example, the issue of gasoline, where there has been a logistical crisis in gas distribution due to the decision to combat to the illegal exploitation of fuels. Well, some say that this wasn't a rational economic decision, that it would be cheaper to let them continue to steal from the pipelines that the fuel is transported in and not have the problems of distribution. It's true in one way that if everything went on the way it was, we wouldn't have these problems. An organized crime will continue to make money, which is another form of economic power.
Very strong one.
Of course. And probably there wouldn't be this inconformity in some cities of the country, but again, this strategy that the new president has defined, which involves the entire executive branch, considers guarding the pipelines, for example, by the army, a central strategic move, and also investigating financial operation. And although this may not be economically rational in the immediate sense, it prioritizes the predominance of a new politics that is necessary to build the new order that they aspire to. They're shaking up a lot of elements of the old order that in many ways was organized like a mafia, like a mob. And to do that you have to affirm the power of the state, which means an inevitable process of centralization the president is carrying out. That will be another defining feature.
This affirmation of the role of the state, especially faced with or actually confronting economic powers, it also brings up the issue of the short-term versus long-term impact. In the case of the gasoline and the scarcity of gasoline because of the change in the distribution system, there's a big outcry, there's a public outcry because it affects directly consumers. on a temporary basis, and yet it's a restructuring of a distribution system in order to get at a broader problem. So what we're seeing possibly here is a president who's willing to take that short-term opposition or the hit, the political cost of some of those measures to really restructure some, particularly in the area of corruption. So you think that these kinds of measures will continue? I think you have to say too that even the administration admits there were some errors in calculation there in terms of what the immediate impact would be. And one of the things that has been different probably with this administration is that they actually did come out and admit that there were errors in calculation.
Yes, I think so. It's true that there are risks, and this is a cost that the federal government is willing to pay. There will be inconformity every time they set out to dismantle a major mob-like structure that involves distribution of resources, services, employment, which are the structures that operate in Mexico today. That's how it is. The current system is a system built on cartels and mafias. So in the system of gas distribution, stealing from the gas pipeline was a normal part of the system on a daily basis. That's the way it worked. Part of the demand was covered by gas taken illegally, and the way things are, part of the labor market for youth has to be satisfied by an infinity of criminal networks. And when those are attacked, there will be protests, and some households will cease to receive the steady income they were used to. The challenge is for the state to have a response to those concerns that come up, and without a doubt, will continue to come up during the whole administration. Now, I think there's a specific trait of Lopez Obrador that makes him different from his predecessors. Politically, he can do it. Peña Nieto couldn't attack the illegal extraction of fuels. Why not? Because you have to have at least enough legitimacy to ask the oil workers union to collaborate, a union in which obliviously there are individuals complicit in those networks. Peña Nieto couldn't do it because the first thing that the union leader Carlos Deschamps will say is, how much did we contribute to your campaign? He'd say, remember all the different ways in which the union supported you, Peña Nieto. They could blackmail him. Also, there's the legitimacy of the votes, because Andres Manuel is a leader. There is no doubt about that. For anyone, for example, Calderón, a problem with fuel that hits hardest for the urban middle class will bring a political crisis of major proportions. I'm sure that if it weren't for the personal legitimacy of Lopez Obrador, this political crisis will be much, much worse. The government has to take this into account because I don't know if it's an excess of confidence, but at least there is a lot of confidence that this legitimacy is going to last the whole time, the whole term. And if this task of dismantling mafia network is going to last the whole term, it will necessary to pick up the battles.
It's such a fine line to walk between what needs to be done in terms of restructuring and measuring the responses, not only in terms of public responses in opposition, like we're seeing now with the gasoline, but also the anticipated responses of organized crime and powerful interests, with such a huge part of the Mexican economy and political system involved directly in that crime. Let's move to the other point that you mentioned, which are social programs. This is the area in which you're working now. What do you see as the major direction and changes in social programs?
There is a part that is focused on youth. That is the Youth Building the Future program. It's about incorporating into the education system or into employment all the young people who currently aren't in either of those large areas of socialization by giving them a grant of around 3,600 pesos a month. This seems to me an important program.
I have a question about that, and there's a part of it that is actually providing payment to employers to provide a first job. How is that different from what Felipe Calderón did, which was essentially practically subsidizing companies to hire youth, and that actually, you know, didn't have the kind of impact I think that his government would have liked?
Yes, that was a subsidy in the form of fiscal breaks in the case of Felipe Calderón that lent itself, because of the way it was set up, to hiring individuals who weren't exactly apprentices as if they were. That is to say, it was a way to make wages more precarious. In this other form, it's the government that's going to pay the wages the first year for young people who are in training. There is, of course, the risk that the same thing happens because there isn't a plan for a system of strict supervision. Why not? I suppose because it will cost a lot. It's true that there is a weakness there, and I guess the idea for dealing with is through the mechanism that the delegates of the government are the ones who mediate between the target population of this social program and the businesses in each region of the country that participate in the program. Now, it's not just businesses that are involved in the program. There will be some employees in public initiatives like reforesting the country. If I may, I will sum up the attempt of the Lopez Obrador administration as a process of centralization to develop two major solutions to the problems of Mexico. One, peace and security, and it has been said that it will be the Secretary of Defense and the National Guard that will take the lead. And two, in social welfare, in addition to those programs, they have laid out a major challenge to the country in creating a decent health system. Here, there is a really big institutional change, but the goal is to have a universal health system that arises from the model of the Mexican Institute for Social Security, accessible to the general population, and that can cover access to the right to health of all Mexicans up to the end of this term.
That moves us into the work that you're doing now. As Secretary General of the Inter-American Conference on Social Security, tell us what this is. Many people haven't heard of the organization, I'm sure.
Yes, the Inter-American Conference is an organization of collaboration and technical research for social welfare. It was founded in 1942 so that the countries would exchange experiences in social welfare and to encourage a cooperative and conciliatory concept of social welfare. That is, where workers and employees as well as governments participate in some respects. And this, I should say, as a history buff, it arose as a part of a hemispheric attempt to prevent the rise of socialism in those years. It evolved, of course, into a place where social policy initiatives could be discussed. For example, the Mexican Institute of Social Security was born practically at the same time, but a little afterward, because the idea of it first came up as a project in the Interamerican Conference. So it's basically to research and discuss the challenges of social welfare, I'd say, in the 21st century, which are not the same at all as those that the conference has been discussing the past years. I think the Social Security institution, not just in Mexico but in the world, have fallen behind the times. I would like to see the work of the conference become much more intense, not only address concerns of the member institutions and the member actors, like the unions that are also involved, but also it should speak to the public and to address these new challenges in social security that are not associated with labor, new solutions that are being proposed with particular urgency since the crisis of 2008 to address the fiscal needs of countries for instituting well-being, to examine universal basic income, in short, issues that should be discussed through the hemisphere.
So it sounds like this is really a platform for defining and modernizing public policy in the area, not just of health and social security, but of well-being and development, and for projecting Mexico's role in those critical areas that the entire region confronts in one way or another. How do you propose to do that as Secretary General now?
Well, I want to put a lot of effort into developing an area of research within the conference that takes advantage of youth, ironically underemployed within youth doctorates, who have trouble finding jobs to research in new labor markets. It's a new demographic area that it's urgently needed. Also, it's necessary for proposing ideal scenarios to being There's a whole worldview, the neoliberal worldview, that put forth a very ambitious intellectual program that had a political side, an economical side, and even an idea of human nature. And then after the breakdown of the neoliberal model in the 2008 crisis, there haven't been ideological alternatives to rethink well-being, to respond to all these ideas that failed. New ideas have to be proposed in economic and political terms, in social and philosophical terms. An idea of human nature that considers advances in science, not just economy, but anthropology, sociology. We have to consider all this according to the circumstances of all of America. What is the kind of social well-being, and ask ourselves what is viable form of well-being in the American continent. Not an illusion of an ideal of development with prefabricated recipes, but rather to think realistically about what kind of social well-being we can achieve here, with the structural limitations we face, with the way that the markets operate, with the level of development, let's say, and demographic evolution in our countries, as well as geopolitical factors. All of these have to be reconsidered. It's not just a matter of elaborating accounting formulas to redistribute pensions. It's about thinking about the system in another way, not just reducing inflation and macroeconomic stability at all costs.
Which have been the priorities up to now.
Exactly.
So it's a creation of viable visions.
Yes. That's what it's about, a vision created from the most general aspect to the most specific aspects of public policy. Antonio Gramsci said that a great intellectual is he or she who develops a thought from the philosophy of the subject to its implementation. I want the Inter-American Conference to be a collective intellectual that makes proposals from the conception and discussion of well-being in our countries, for which I'm going to invite all the countries of America, to public policies that can be useful for every one of the countries without regard of their current political circumstances.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of the program very quickly. Thanks for being with us, Gibrán Ramírez.
Thank you.
And thank you all for watching. We'll be back next week on Interviews from Mexico.